You know, life has a funny way of showing you who really means it. One day, he's joking around, proposing like it's a punchline, and weeks later, he's on his knees, begging me for the one thing I've always wanted, and all I could do was smile. Ladies, let me tell you something, love isn't always grand gestures and perfect timing. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's confusing, and sometimes it comes wrapped in a joke. But here's the truth, when someone truly wants you, when someone truly sees your worth, no joke can hide it, no hesitation can stop it. That's exactly what happened to me. He thought proposing to me would be funny, he thought I'd laugh it off, but weeks later, everything changed. And the smile I wore that day wasn't just about happiness, it was about knowing my value, knowing what I deserve, and finally seeing him realize it too. It all started on a warm Saturday afternoon when he decided to be playful in a way that would leave me questioning everything. At the same time, he had that mischievous glint in his eye that I had seen many times before, but this time it was different because it came with words that would hang in the air long after the laughter faded. He looked at me with that grin that said he had a secret, and then he leaned forward and with all the humor he could muster he asked, "Will you marry me?" I could feel the heat rise to my cheeks and I looked around to see that our friends were all watching with expectant smiles, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the laughter, and I played along because at that moment everyone laughed including me, but deep down inside I could feel the flutter of something that was not just amusement, it was curiosity, it was questioning, it was the start of a realization that this moment was more than just a joke because I knew him. I knew that he loved to tease, that he loved to push boundaries, that he loved to see reactions that were genuine and spontaneous, but even with all that understanding I could not shake the feeling that there was a truth hidden behind the humor, that there was a part of him that was testing not just me but the possibility of what could be if he were serious. And that is when I realized something important about love, something about how it often comes disguised in moments that seem insignificant, moments that seem lighthearted or even foolish but carry within them seeds of intention that can grow if nurtured. The joke proposal was one of those seeds. It was small, it was fleeting, it could have been brushed off with a laugh and a shake of the head, but I sensed that it was more than that. It was a glimpse into his imagination, into the way he thought about us, into the way he imagined a future that included both of us. And even though it was wrapped in jest, it made me pause and reflect on what I wanted, what I valued, and how I expected to be treated in matters of the heart. I laughed. I admitted to my friends that I was shocked and slightly embarrassed. I smiled to hide the sudden rush of emotions I felt, but I also observed closely. I watched his eyes, I watched the way he waited for my reaction, I watched the subtle shifts in his posture and the almost imperceptible hesitation that betrayed a seriousness he did not voice. He was testing me, yes, but he was also testing himself, and in that moment I realized that even when words are playful, the truth behind them can be powerful and revealing, because as women we often look for the grand gestures, the elaborate displays of affection, the carefully thought out plans and surprises, but sometimes the truth comes in the simplest forms, in a joke, in a playful comment, in a fleeting question that can make us laugh and yet make our hearts race at the same time. And that is what happened that day. I felt a mix of emotions that I could not immediately name. I felt amusement, I felt surprise, I felt curiosity, I felt a faint flicker of desire, and I felt a quiet recognition that this man even in jest saw a future that included me. And I could not ignore that. Even as I smiled and laughed, I caught myself imagining a life where perhaps this playful man could one day be serious, a life where his jokes could evolve into promises, a life where his playful glances could turn into sincere expressions of devotion. I realized then that the value of a joke is not always in the laughter it produces, but in the insight it provides into a person's mind and heart. It is in the way it shows us what someone truly feels beneath the surface and how they imagine the possibilities that lie ahead. I also realized something about myself. I realized that my response to the joke was telling. I realized that my patience, my composure, my ability to not immediately jump at the words or react impulsively was in itself a measure of my self-respect and my understanding of what I deserved, and I felt proud of that. I did not need to give an answer right then and there. I did not need to fall for the momentary excitement or the temporary charm. I could observe, I could reflect, I could assess the intentions behind the words, and that gave me power over the situation. It gave me control over my emotions and over the path that my heart would eventually take. And so I smiled, I laughed, I teased back, I played along in a way that allowed the moment to pass but never let it go unnoticed. In my mind it was recorded, it was analyzed, it was appreciated for what it truly was, a glimpse into a potential future and a test of sincerity. It was the beginning of a journey, not just for him to to understand what I meant to him but for me to understand what I meant to myself, what I valued, what I expected, and how I would respond when the time came to face real intentions. The joke proposal became a story I replayed in my mind over the next few days and weeks. I would think about the tone of his voice, the subtle hesitations, the nervous excitement in his eyes, and I would consider what it meant that someone could mix humor with a hint of seriousness in such a delicate balance. I realized that love is not always presented on a silver platter with clear labels. Love sometimes comes disguised in moments of uncertainty and playfulness, and the key is to recognize when those moments are windows into something deeper and to act with wisdom and awareness, because I understood that day that if I responded purely to the laughter, if I responded purely to the shock, if I responded purely to the surface, I might miss the truth that lay beneath. And women, my sisters, that is a lesson worth remembering for the rest of your lives. Always look beneath the surface, always notice the subtleties, always appreciate the small tests and small jokes, because they may carry within them the seeds of something powerful and life-changing. I understood that my laughter was not a rejection, it was a recognition of the moment, it was an acknowledgement that I was aware of the words and of the intention, and that I was choosing to respond with grace and patience rather than haste and impulsiveness. That is why the joke proposal mattered. It was not in the words themselves, it was in the potential they represented, it was in the moment of reflection, it was in the pause it created that allowed me to assess my feelings and his intentions, it was in the awareness that true love often announces itself quietly, not always boldly, and it is the woman who notices these quiet announcements who ultimately holds the power to choose wisely. And so that first key moment, the joke proposal, became a cornerstone of our story, not because it was serious, not because it was perfect, but because it revealed something essential about both of us, about how we approached love, about how we valued patience and sincerity, about how we understood that laughter and seriousness are not opposites but companions in the journey of discovering true devotion. And as I recall that day, I smile not just at the memory of the joke but at the knowledge that I recognized the truth behind it, that I understood the dance that was being played out, and that I had the wisdom to wait and observe and reflect before giving my heart away. I knew then that this moment was only the beginning, and that the journey ahead would test both of us in ways we could not yet imagine. But I was confident that having recognized the depth behind a joke, I was prepared to face whatever came next with awareness, grace, and a steadfast belief in my own worth. After that joke proposal, I found myself in a space I had not expected, a place between amusement and contemplation, where the mind refuses to settle and the heart is unwilling to give away more than it has to. I watched him walk away after the laughter subsided, and I felt a strange mixture of curiosity and caution. There was something in his eyes that hinted at more than just something, that whispered of possibilities, but I refused to be swept away by mere words alone. I understood even then that love is not measured by a momentary declaration, it is measured by consistency, by the depth of action, and by the willingness to prove oneself when there is no audience and no applause. And so I began the waiting game. The waiting game is something every woman learns sooner or later. It is not always easy, it is not always graceful, it tests patience and endurance, it examines your ability to trust your own instincts, and it forces you to observe the actions of another before handing over your heart, because words can be fleeting but actions reveal the truth. And that is a lesson I took seriously. I did not respond impulsively to his playful proposal. I did not give him a laugh or a shrug as if to say I am flattered. I simply waited. I let the days pass and watched him with careful attention, noticing how he carried himself, how he spoke, how he made time for me even when there were other demands on his life. And I realized quickly that this was a man who valued humor but also had a seriousness tucked somewhere beneath the surface, a seriousness that I needed to see before I could believe that his words could mean more than amusement. I noticed how he checked in with me without being asked, how he remembered small details about my day, how he made gestures that were subtle but meaningful, gestures that spoke of thoughtfulness, care, and the kind of attentiveness that goes beyond surface charm. I watched him interact with others with kindness and respect, and I observed how he treated moments of tension or disagreement with patience and composure. And in all of these observations I began to see the layers of his character, the parts that were not visible in a playful moment, the parts that mattered in a relationship, the parts that determined whether love could truly grow or falter. And as I waited, I reflected on myself, I reflected on my own desires, my own expectations, and my own worth. I understood that my patience was not passive, it was active, it was intentional, it was a measure of my self-respect and my awareness that I deserved more than a fleeting laugh or a passing fancy. I realized that the waiting game was teaching me about my own power, about the control I have over my heart and my emotions, and about the standards I would uphold in matters of love. I observed how he navigated social situations, how he responded when things did not go his way, and how he treated the people around him. And I began to see a pattern, a consistency, a proof that beneath the jokes lay a genuine heart, a heart capable of care. and commitment, and that realization gave me hope, but it also reminded me to continue observing, to continue discerning, and to continue valuing my own needs over my desire to rush to a conclusion. I spoke with friends, I confided in family, I reflected on past relationships and lessons learned, and I noticed that so often women rush to accept words without seeing the substance behind them, and that is why I chose the waiting game, because I understood that patience does not mean indifference, it does not mean coldness, it does not mean lack of interest, it means a deep awareness that true love cannot be forced or rushed, it must be cultivated, nurtured, and demonstrated over time. And so I waited, and during that waiting I began to notice even the smallest gestures, the phone calls that were longer than necessary, the surprise messages that brightened a dull afternoon, the willingness to listen without judgment, the moments he prioritized me without anyone noticing, the subtle but significant signs of care that speak louder than a grand declaration could ever do. I began to see that his heart was leaning towards me, not in a showy way but in a genuine way, and that realization was more important than the joke proposal that had started it all, because the joke had been a spark but the waiting revealed the flame. I realized that if I had rushed, if I had responded too quickly, I might have missed the depth of his intentions, I might have accepted words without seeing actions, and that could have led to disappointment and heartbreak. And I understood that waiting does not make you weak, it makes you wise, it gives clarity, it allows discernment, and it ensures that when love is reciprocated it is genuine and steadfast. And that understanding gave me strength and confidence. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle changes in him. I noticed a seriousness creeping into his demeanor, a sincerity in his conversations, a patience in his interactions that had not been there before, and I realized that the waiting game was affecting both of us. It was teaching him the value of persistence, of intentionality, and of proving oneself, and it was teaching me the value of observation, of self-respect, and of discernment. I smiled to myself because I understood that life often requires us to pause, to observe, and to let things unfold naturally rather than forcing an outcome or giving away our hearts too easily, and that is a lesson that cannot be rushed. The waiting game is not passive, it is active, it is a conscious decision to honor oneself and to ensure that love is earned and not merely claimed. And as I continued to watch and reflect, I found a quiet joy in knowing that my patience was not wasted, that my standards were not a burden but a guide that would eventually lead to a love that was authentic and meaningful. And I found comfort in the knowledge that when he did eventually take the next step, it would not be because of pressure or haste but because he truly understood and valued what I meant to him. And that is a kind of power every woman should recognize within herself, the power to wait, to observe, to assess, to reflect, and to hold herself to a standard that ensures her heart is treated with care and respect. The waiting game taught me about timing, about the importance of consistency, about the way intentions are revealed through actions, and it reinforced the idea that love is not a race or a competition, it is a journey, and sometimes the most significant moments are the ones that arrive quietly after careful thought and attention. I realized that by allowing him the space to show his intentions, I was also allowing myself to see the man behind the joke, the man capable of sincerity, the man capable of humility, the man capable of love. And I understood that when the time came to make a decision, my choice would be informed not by a single moment of humor but by weeks of observation, of genuine effort and heartfelt intention, and that realization brought me peace and confidence. I knew then that waiting was not a sign of indecision, it was a sign of wisdom, that it was an acknowledgement of my own worth and a commitment to ensuring that when I finally said yes, it would be to a love that had proven itself worthy. And as the days continued, I noticed how even the smallest moments mattered, the casual check-ins, the genuine laughter, the way he made me feel seen and appreciated in ways that words alone could never accomplish. And I understood that all of these moments together created a mosaic of intention and sincerity that was far more meaningful than the initial joke proposal ever could have been. And so the waiting game became not just a period of observation but a journey of reflection, growth, and preparation, a time to ensure that my heart was ready for what was to come and that I could recognize true love when it finally arrived. And I felt proud of myself for honoring my own standards, for valuing patience, and for understanding that sometimes the most important lessons in love are taught not in moments of excitement but in moments of quiet observation, reflection, and discernment. Weeks passed after the initial joke proposal, and the waiting period became a time of reflection and careful observation. I began to notice the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his voice carried a new sincerity, the way his gestures became more deliberate and thoughtful, and I realized that the joke had served its purpose. It had been the spark that started a process of self-awareness in him and reflection in me. I saw how he thought before he spoke, how he considered my feelings before he acted, and I began to understand that this was no longer the playful man who had made a joke in front of friends. This was a man who was beginning to recognize the weight of his feelings and the importance of my presence in his life. I noticed the texts that were no longer casual but filled with genuine questions about my day, about my feelings, about what mattered to me. I noticed the calls that lingered longer than before, that carried a tone of care and attentiveness that I had not heard prior, and I realized that true intention is often revealed not in grand statements but in small consistent actions, in the way someone remembers details about you, in the way they make time when it would be easier to ignore, in the way they respond with patience rather than irritation. I began to understand that he was proving his seriousness not with dramatic gestures but with quiet persistence, and that is when the realization struck me that he was no longer joking, that he had begun to internalize the value of my heart and the worth of my love. I reflected on the meaning of true intent and how often in life people confuse words with actions, how often promises are made lightly without the backing of commitment, and I knew then that what mattered most was not what he said but what he demonstrated consistently over days and weeks. I watched him interact with others and I noticed the changes in the way he carried himself. I noticed how he treated people who could not benefit him, how he responded to challenges and disappointments, and I saw a pattern emerging, a pattern of integrity, kindness, patience, and respect, and I realized that this pattern extended to me, that he was making a conscious choice to show up in a way that was meaningful and authentic, and that realization brought a sense of calm and assurance that I had not felt during the initial joke proposal. I began to appreciate the importance of observation in relationships. I began to understand that love is not simply given or taken, it is proven, it is nurtured, it is demonstrated through intentional acts that show understanding, empathy, and devotion, and I reflected on my own role in this journey. In the waiting period, in the process of observing and discerning, I realized that my patience had allowed him the space to grow, to recognize his feelings, and to understand the importance of treating me with care and respect. I understood that self-respect is not just about asserting boundaries, it is about allowing others the opportunity to rise to the level of your expectations and to demonstrate the seriousness of their intentions. I found a quiet joy in noticing the small but meaningful ways he expressed himself, the thoughtful gestures, the careful listening, the sincere compliments, the willingness to adjust and consider, and I realized that these actions were far more valuable than any words could have been alone. They spoke of commitment, of genuine feeling, and of a desire to invest in a shared future, and as I observed I also reflected on the power of discernment, of understanding that not every gesture is equal, not every statement is truthful, not every display of affection is authentic. I learned to recognize sincerity in tone, in consistency, in attention, in the subtle ways that reveal the heart behind the words, and I began to see him in a new light, a light that illuminated the man capable of true intention, capable of humility, and capable of love beyond fleeting amusement. I recognized that the joke proposal had been the starting point, the first test, the first moment that allowed me to gauge his reaction to me and to my standards, and now weeks later the true measure of his intent was emerging through his consistent actions and mindful choices. I reflected on the importance of this realization for my own growth as well, for understanding that waiting and observing is not passive, it is active, it is a conscious choice to honor oneself and to ensure that the love one gives is reciprocated with equal care and attention. I began to notice my own reactions to these changes in him, the way my heart would quietly lift at a thoughtful message, the way my mind would relax knowing he was making an effort to show up fully, and I realized that this awareness was teaching me about the qualities I valued in a partner, about the importance of intentionality, about the need for consistency, and about the power of genuine care. I saw how he made decisions that reflected his understanding of my worth, how he prioritized moments with me without grand announcements, how he allowed sincerity to guide his actions rather than relying solely on charm or humor, and I understood that true intention is a combination of thoughtfulness, patience, and genuine care that builds slowly over time. I reflected on how often people fail to notice these subtle but meaningful signals, how often women are taught to respond quickly to words without observing actions, and I felt a sense of pride in myself for having chosen to be patient, for having chosen to watch for signs of true intention rather than rushing into emotion. I recognize that in life meaningful love is not about speed, it is about depth, it is about authenticity, it is about the consistent demonstration of care, and I saw that he was showing all of these qualities in ways that could not be ignored. I thought about the power of realization, how awareness of someone's true intentions can transform perception, how observing actions can reveal truths that words alone cannot capture, and I felt a quiet excitement knowing that he was stepping into a space of sincerity that I had been waiting for weeks to witness. I realized that this period of observation observation had allowed me to see the man behind the playful exterior, the man capable of growth, capable of recognizing the value of what he almost overlooked, and capable of proving himself in meaningful ways. I began to feel a sense of calm confidence, knowing that when the moment of decision came I would be fully aware of his intentions and fully aware of my own readiness to accept love that was genuine. I reflected on the lessons learned through this process, the importance of patience, the power of discernment, the necessity of observing actions over words, the need to honor one's own standards, and the significance of allowing time for genuine feelings to emerge. I understood that the realization of true intent is a powerful moment, a moment that can change the trajectory of a relationship, and I felt grateful that I had been able to witness it without rushing, without judgment, and with a full awareness of my own worth. I noticed that even in casual interactions there was a sincerity emerging that had not existed before. The jokes were replaced with thoughtful comments, the playful gestures were accompanied by genuine attention, and the light-hearted humor carried a new weight of understanding and care. I realized that this transformation was not instantaneous, it was the product of time, patience, observation, and reflection, and that in itself was a powerful lesson about how love grows when it is nurtured intentionally and when actions align with feelings. I saw that he was no longer the man who had made a joke proposal. He was a man who had begun to recognize his feelings, a man who had begun to understand the importance of proving his intentions, and a man who had begun to show a consistency that spoke louder than any words ever could. And I understood that this realization of true intent was the foundation on which the next stage of our journey would be built, a foundation of trust, of awareness, of respect, and of genuine love. And I felt a sense of quiet joy and anticipation, knowing that when the time came for the next step it would be grounded in sincerity, and that our hearts would meet with a clear understanding of true intention. And that is the power of observation, the power of discernment, and the power of waiting to witness the truth behind the words. And I felt confident in knowing that the journey we had started with a playful joke had evolved into a path of genuine connection built on the realization of true intent, and that this realization would guide us forward into the next chapter of our story with awareness, appreciation, and heartfelt understanding. The day he came to me on his knees was a day that seemed ordinary at first but would forever be etched into my memory. I had been going about my routine, thinking about life and love, reflecting on the weeks that had passed since the joke proposal and the careful observation that had followed. I had felt a quiet sense of satisfaction knowing that patience and discernment had allowed me to witness his true intentions. And then he appeared standing at the doorway, eyes focused on me with an intensity that immediately drew my attention. I could feel a shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness of purpose, a sincerity that was palpable before he even spoke. He took a deep breath, and in that moment I realized that this was no longer the playful man who had made a joke in front of friends. This was a man who had carried the weight of his feelings with him, a man who had reflected on his actions and understood the value of what he almost risked losing. I watched him slowly lower himself to the floor, his knees touching the ground, and I felt a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and anticipation, my heart beating faster, my mind racing through possibilities. I had imagined this moment in countless ways, in my dreams, in my reflections, in quiet moments of hope, but seeing it unfold in reality was unlike anything I had expected. His hands were slightly trembling, his eyes fixed on mine, and I noticed the humility in his posture, the vulnerability that comes only when a person truly opens their heart without pretense. He spoke my name softly, and then he told me the truth. He admitted the folly of the joke proposal, he acknowledged the uncertainty and the hesitation, and he expressed in the most genuine way his understanding of my worth and his desire to have me in his life, not as a fleeting amusement but as a lifelong partner. I listened quietly, absorbing every word, weighing every syllable, feeling the sincerity behind the tremor in his voice, the deliberate pauses, the raw emotion that he could not hide. Even as I listened I noticed the courage it must have taken for him to come to me in that way, to humble himself, to let go of pride and ego, and to show his heart fully. I reflected on how often people shy away from vulnerability, how often they mask true intentions behind bravado or humor, and I understood then that this moment was a gift, a revelation, and a test all at once. Because it revealed the depth of his feelings, it gave me the chance to witness true humility, and it tested my own awareness, patience, and self-respect. I felt a quiet smile form on my lips, not because I relished his plea but because I recognized the power of this moment, the significance of the act, the beauty in witnessing someone come fully into their own sincerity. I realized that being on his knees was not a sign of weakness, it was a demonstration of understanding. It was an acknowledgement that love requires honesty, courage, and sometimes the surrender of pride. I remembered the weeks of observation, the texts, the calls, the thoughtful gestures, the subtle consistency that had led to this very point, and I understood that every small act had been building toward this revelation. Every moment of patience I had practiced, every pause I had allowed, every reflection I had made was now rewarded unfolded with clarity and truth. I felt proud of myself for having waited for this moment, for having recognized the signs, for having held my heart with care and dignity, and for allowing him the opportunity to rise to the level of my expectations. I noticed the sincerity in his eyes, the way they searched mine for acknowledgement, the way they reflected a mixture of fear, hope, and desperation, and I understood that vulnerability is powerful, it is transformative, and it creates a space for genuine connection. I thought about all the moments leading up to this one, all the playful jokes, the casual interactions, the patient observations, and I realized that this day was the culmination of intention, effort, and self-awareness, not just on his part but on mine as well. I saw in his posture the embodiment of growth, the manifestation of reflection, the realization that words alone are not enough and that actions must align with feelings to create authenticity. I felt my heart respond not with haste but with understanding, appreciation, and recognition that he had taken the time to prove himself capable of love that is patient, observant, and sincere. I reflected on the symbolism of kneeling on one knee, the humility, the recognition of my worth, the acknowledgement of past mistakes, and the commitment to a future built on respect and devotion. I felt a deep sense of validation knowing that he had arrived at this point through genuine reflection and not mere impulse. I considered the lessons that this moment conveyed, the power of patience, the importance of discernment, the value of consistent effort, the necessity of humility, and the transformative nature of sincere intention. I realized that this was a defining moment not just in our relationship but in my own understanding of love and self-respect, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the experience, to absorb the emotion, to recognize the significance, and to embrace the validation of my own standards and expectations. I noticed the trembling of his hands, the quiver in his voice, the slight hesitations that betrayed vulnerability, and I understood that this was not an act, it was the truth laid bare, a man stripped of pretension, fully acknowledging the value of my heart and the importance of the love he sought. I felt a mixture of joy, relief, and empowerment, a recognition that love is not about rushing to declarations, it is about waiting, observing, reflecting, and allowing sincerity to reveal itself in actions and in truth. I remembered all the times I had questioned myself, all the moments of doubt, all the reflections on patience and self-respect, and I realized that this moment was a validation of every choice I had made, every pause I had allowed, every insight I had trusted. I smiled because I understood that smiles have power. They convey confidence, they communicate self-assurance, they reflect the awareness that one's heart is treated with the respect it deserves and that the other person has demonstrated the capability to honor it fully. I watched as he continued to speak, expressing his desire to build a life together, acknowledging the mistakes of the past and promising to act with integrity, sincerity, and devotion. I noted the careful choice of words, the deliberate pauses, the emphasis on truthfulness, and I realized that every element of his presentation reflected a newfound awareness and an understanding of what love truly requires. I felt my heart respond with warmth and quiet affirmation, a recognition that the journey from joke to sincerity had been intentional, thoughtful, and authentic. I reflected on the power of observation, the value of discernment, the necessity of patience, and the importance of allowing someone the space to recognize the significance of your heart before accepting their intentions fully. I understood then that the act of kneeling on one knee was more than symbolic, it was transformational. It revealed growth, humility, understanding, sincerity, and commitment, and it created a bridge between the playful beginnings and the authentic future that could now be envisioned. I felt the full impact of the moment, the gravity of intention, the beauty of vulnerability, the strength in humility, and the empowerment of recognizing my own worth. And as he looked up at me, eyes glistening with emotion, I realized that I had the power to respond not with haste but with awareness, not with obligation but with appreciation for the sincerity being offered. I smiled fully because the smile conveyed understanding, recognition, patience, and empowerment. It communicated that I had observed, I had waited, I had discerned, and now I acknowledged the truth that had been revealed. I realized that this moment would remain with me forever as a reminder of the power of patience, the significance of intention, and the beauty of genuine vulnerability. I understood that the act of coming to me on his knees was not just a plea for love, it was an acknowledgement of the journey we had both undertaken, a journey of reflection, observation, growth, and recognition, and I allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of the experience, the lessons learned, the validation received, and the anticipation of what could now unfold. I smiled because I recognized the alignment of actions and intentions, the sincerity of emotion, and the readiness of our hearts to meet on equal footing, and I knew that this moment would define the next chapter of our story, a chapter built on honesty, respect, love, and the profound understanding that true connection requires time, effort, and the courage to show one's heart fully, and that smile carried with it the weight of self-respect, empowerment, recognition, and hope for the future, a hope grounded in the knowledge that love, when nurtured with patience and discernment, will always reveal itself in the most genuine and transformative ways. I smiled that day not just because he was on his knees but because I understood the power of self-respect and how it shapes every moment of our lives and every choice we make. I realized in that instant that self-respect is not something we show to others, it is something we hold within. It is a quiet strength, a steady confidence, a knowing of our own worth that does not need validation from anyone else. I thought about all the times in life when women compromise themselves for attention, approval, or love, when they rush to say yes or to respond because they fear losing someone or because they believe that their value is measured by the eagerness of others to claim them. I thought about how often society teaches us that love is something we must chase, something we must grab at even when it is not offered genuinely, and I understood that my smile was a declaration that I would never allow that to happen to me. I had waited, I had observed, I had discerned, and I had held my heart carefully because I knew that rushing or settling would have cheapened the depth of what I deserved. I realized then that the power of self-respect is in its patience, its awareness, and its refusal to accept anything less than sincerity and care. I smiled because I had exercised that power every day leading up to this moment. Every choice I had made to pause, every judgment I had withheld until I could see clearly, every boundary I had set to protect my heart was now validated in the sincerity of his actions and words. I understood that self-respect is not arrogance, it is not pride, it is not about making others prove themselves for the sake of control. It is about knowing your own worth and allowing others the space to recognize and honor it. I thought about the moments in my past when I had not held that power, when I had allowed impulsive decisions to guide my heart, and I realized how much stronger I had become through patience and reflection, how much wiser I was now in recognizing authenticity and intention. I felt a quiet joy in knowing that my self-respect had not only protected me but had also guided him to a place of genuine understanding, that without my awareness and steadfastness he might not have realized the depth of his feelings or the importance of demonstrating sincerity. I reflected on how self-respect is a lesson women learn over time, how it is cultivated through experiences, observation, reflection, and the conscious decision to honor one's own heart. I realized that it is not always easy to hold that power. It requires discipline, courage, and sometimes the strength to walk away from situations that do not honor our worth. I thought about how many times people mistake love for compromise, how many times they sacrifice their own standards for the illusion of connection, and I felt grateful that I had learned early on that my heart deserves more than convenience, more than casual attention, more than empty words. I smiled because I understood that by holding my standards high I was not creating barriers, I was creating a path for genuine love, a love that recognizes and cherishes the value of my heart, and by doing so I had allowed him the opportunity to rise to that level, to prove through action rather than jest that his intentions were real and that he could honor me fully. I realized that self-respect is intertwined with empowerment. It is the ability to recognize that you are the gatekeeper of your own heart, that your love is not something to be thrown away lightly, and that the measure of someone's sincerity is revealed through the consistency of their actions rather than the cleverness of their words. I thought about the impact of that understanding on relationships, on life, on the choices we make, and I felt a profound sense of clarity knowing that self-respect is the foundation upon which genuine love is built. I smiled because I recognized the journey that had brought me to this moment, the weeks of observation, the careful reflection, the patience that allowed me to see beyond humor to truth to intention, and I understood that self-respect had been my guide throughout this journey, my anchor and my compass. It had given me the courage to wait, it had given me the wisdom to discern, and it had given me the power to smile in the face of a plea for love, knowing that I was not yielding but recognizing. I thought about the lessons that I could share with every woman, about the importance of holding her own standards high, about the necessity of valuing oneself above fleeting amusement or attention, about the power of allowing time for true intentions to reveal themselves. I understood that self-respect is not passive, it is active, it is engaged, it is deliberate, and it requires constant nurturing. Just as a garden must be tended to flourish, so must our own awareness of worth and boundaries. I reflected on how holding self-respect allows us to navigate life with confidence and clarity, how it shapes our interactions, how it influences the decisions of those around us, and how it ensures that when we accept love, it is love that honors us fully. I thought about the joy of knowing that by honoring my own heart I had inspired him to honor mine, that my patience and steadfastness had allowed him to rise to the occasion, to demonstrate sincerity, to show through action what words alone could never convey. And I smiled because I understood that self-respect creates a space for others to grow, to show their true intentions, and to demonstrate their commitment in ways that are authentic and meaningful. I realized that the power of self-respect is not in demanding respect from others but in refusing to settle for less than one deserves, in recognizing that the heart is not a prize to be won through jest or charm but a treasure to be nurtured and honored. I thought about how often people overlook this truth, how often hearts are given away too quickly, and how much stronger our lives could be if we embraced the discipline, patience and courage that self-respect requires. I smiled because I knew that I had done just that. I had allowed myself to be patient, to observe, to reflect, to discern, and now I was witnessing the reward in the sincerity of his actions and the authenticity of his plea. I understood that every woman has this power within her, that it is a choice every day to honor oneself, to set boundaries, to hold the heart with care, and to recognize that true love cannot be rushed or forced but must be cultivated and demonstrated with intention. I reflected on the freedom that comes from self-respect, the liberation of knowing that our value is inherent, that our hearts are worthy of care and devotion, and that we do not need to compromise our standards for validation or acceptance. I smiled because I felt that freedom fully. I recognized that this moment was the embodiment of the power of self-respect in action, the culmination of patience, reflection, observation, and steadfastness, and I allowed myself to absorb the magnitude of it all, the realization that by honoring myself I had also allowed him the opportunity to rise to the level of sincerity and love that I deserved. I thought about the ripple effect of this understanding in all areas of life, in relationships, friendships, careers, choices, and how the power of self-respect influences the way we navigate the world and the people we allow into our lives. I felt gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, for the awareness that had led me here, and I smiled because I understood that the smile was more than an expression. It was a statement, a declaration, a recognition of the power I held within and the care I had taken to protect and honor it. I realized that by maintaining self-respect I had shaped not just this moment but the future that lay ahead, a future grounded in authenticity, sincerity, love, and the unwavering understanding of my own worth. And I felt joy, confidence, anticipation, and empowerment, knowing that every action I had taken to uphold my standards had been validated, and that this moment of genuine intention and vulnerability would forever remind me of the importance of self-respect and the transformative power it carries in shaping love, in shaping life, and in shaping the recognition of one's own value. And I smiled fully because I knew that the lessons of self-respect are not only for myself but for every woman who dares to hold her heart with care and patience and refuses to settle for anything less than the love and devotion she deserves. Finally, the reward of being true to myself became clear in that moment when he knelt before me, and I smiled not out of arrogance or superiority but out of a deep understanding that love cannot be rushed, it cannot be demanded, and it cannot be forced. It must be earned, demonstrated, and aligned with intention. I realized that every pause, every moment of observation, every decision to hold my heart with care had led to this culmination of authenticity and sincerity. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from the playful joke proposal to weeks of observation, to the realization of his true intent, and to the humility of his plea on his knees, and I understood that being true to oneself is not a simple task. It requires patience, awareness, self-respect, and a refusal to settle for anything less than genuine. I thought about the moments when life tempts us to compromise, when it encourages us to ignore red flags, when it pressures us to accept half-hearted efforts for the illusion of connection, and I felt grateful that I had chosen a different path, a path of clarity, discernment, and unwavering commitment to my own worth. I smiled because I recognized that the reward of being true to oneself is not always immediate, it is not always flashy or dramatic, it is quiet, subtle, and deeply fulfilling. It is the calm assurance that when love arrives, it is love that is aligned with our values, our standards, and our hearts. I considered the lessons learned through this process, the importance of patience, the power of observation, the necessity of discernment, the significance of humility, and the impact of consistent intentional action, and I realized that these lessons are what create the foundation for a love that is lasting, meaningful, and transformative. I reflected on how often we compromise our true selves in relationships, how often we bend to accommodate others at the expense of our own standards, and how often we give away our hearts too quickly without ensuring that the love we receive is worthy. And I understood that by being true to myself I had ensured that the love being offered was authentic, sincere, and aligned with the values I hold dear. I noticed the way his eyes glistened with emotion, the way his hands shook slightly with vulnerability, the way his voice carried a sincerity that could not be manufactured, and I realized that these actions were a direct result of my steadfastness, the result of holding my heart with care, the result of being patient and discerning and refusing to settle for anything less than the truth. I thought about how the reward of being true to oneself is intertwined with empowerment, because when we honor our own standards we create a space for others to rise to the occasion, to demonstrate authenticity and commitment, and that is exactly what he had done. I reflected on the sense of confidence and clarity that comes from knowing that our decisions are guided by awareness and intention, that our hearts are not given away lightly, that our love is cherished and not taken for granted, and I felt a profound sense of joy and satisfaction knowing that every moment of patience, observation, and discernment had led to this manifestation of genuine connection. I considered the ripple effect effect of being true to oneself, how it influences the people around us, how it shapes the dynamics of relationships, how it sets a standard for how we are treated, and how it ensures that the love we accept honors the value of our hearts. I smiled because I understood that my choice to remain true to myself had not only protected my heart but had also inspired his actions, guided his growth, and encouraged him to step into authenticity and sincerity. I reflected on the power of recognition, the ability to see intention behind actions, to appreciate consistent effort, to notice the subtleties that reveal truth, and to respond with awareness and gratitude. I realized that these skills are cultivated through being true to oneself, and that they create the conditions for meaningful love. I thought about the patience it had taken to wait, to observe, to reflect, to discern, to recognize the signs, and I understood that this patience was a reward in itself because it allowed me to witness the full spectrum of his intentions, to see growth, to experience humility, and to recognize sincerity. I considered how often we settle for instant gratification in relationships, how often we ignore the signs that love is genuine, and how often we mistake charm or words for authenticity, and I felt grateful that I had chosen to remain true to myself and to allow the process to unfold naturally. I smiled because I recognized that true love is not rushed, it is nurtured through consistent action aligned with intention and reinforced by the awareness and self-respect of those involved. I reflected on the empowerment that comes from this awareness, the confidence it instills, the clarity it provides, the protection it offers, and the fulfillment it creates. I understood that the reward of being true to oneself is not just in witnessing sincere love, it is in the deep satisfaction of knowing that we have honored our own hearts and standards, and that we have created the conditions for love that is worthy and lasting. I noticed how the weeks of observation, the careful discernment, the patience and reflection had all converged in this one moment when he knelt before me, and I smiled because I understood the significance of each choice, each pause, each act of self-respect that had led to this manifestation of authenticity, and I realized that this smile was a celebration of the journey, the growth, and the empowerment that comes from being true to oneself. I reflected on the lessons this moment teaches every woman, the importance of knowing your worth, of holding your standards high, of refusing to settle, of recognizing sincerity through consistent action, and of allowing time for love to reveal itself in its most genuine form. I smiled because I understood that the reward is multifaceted, the fulfillment of seeing true intention, the empowerment of honoring oneself, the confidence gained from discernment, the peace that comes from patience, and the joy of witnessing authenticity and vulnerability meet in alignment. I thought about how often life tests our commitment to ourselves, how often it challenges our patience and self-respect, how often it tempts us to accept less than we deserve, and I felt grateful that I had remained steadfast, that I had honored my own heart, and that the reward had arrived in the form of sincerity, humility, and genuine love. I considered the journey ahead, the possibilities for our future, and I recognized that being true to oneself not only shapes the present moment but also creates the conditions for a relationship built on honesty, respect, and deep connection. I smiled fully because I knew that every moment of patience, reflection, observation, and self-respect had been worth it, that the reward was not fleeting but enduring, that the love being offered was grounded in authenticity, and that the foundation of our relationship was now solidly built on the principles of being true to oneself. I reflected on the impact of this awareness on all areas of life, on relationships, friendships, career choices, and personal growth, and I understood that the lessons of patience, discernment, self-respect, and authenticity extend far beyond love. They shape the way we navigate the world, the decisions we make, and the connections we cultivate. I smiled because I recognized that the reward of being true to oneself is not just the love we receive, it is the empowerment we gain, the confidence we nurture, the clarity we achieve, and the fulfillment we experience. And I understood that this moment when he knelt before me was a culmination of all these rewards, a vivid manifestation of the power of patience, self-respect, discernment, and authenticity. I reflected on the symbolism of the moment, the humility of his posture, the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability of his plea, and I understood that it was the perfect reflection of the journey we had undertaken, the weeks of observation, the careful reflection, the thoughtful discernment, and the steadfast commitment to honoring one's own heart. I smiled because I recognized that the reward is not simply the love itself but the empowerment, confidence, clarity, patience, and authenticity that comes from being true to oneself, and I allowed myself to absorb the full magnitude of the experience, to feel the joy, the satisfaction, the empowerment, the confidence, and the peace that comes with knowing that our hearts have been honored and that love has arrived in its most genuine form. I realized then that the reward of being true to oneself is a lifelong lesson, a guiding principle, a foundation For meaningful connection and a source of empowerment that shapes not just our love but our lives. And I smiled because I knew that by remaining true to myself I had not only received the love I deserved but had also embraced the full power of patience, self-respect, discernment and authenticity. And that smile carried with it the knowledge that love, when nurtured with these principles, will always reveal itself in its most genuine and transformative form.